Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Todd Persen. I work with the data observability team at Pivotal out of Denver. And this is a talk about observability using the Metricstor product that we've been working on for the last year or so. So a little bit of an overview about the talk. So we kind of wanted to talk about the concept of observability, what it is, why it matters, and just kind of how to think about it within a Cloud Foundry deployment in particular. And then talk to you a little bit about Metricstor itself, why we built it, what it's good for, and how it can be useful with Cloud Foundry. And then just kind of wanted to talk in general about what makes Metricstor special and why it makes observability easier than other products, other data storage and observability tools. And just kind of go over some examples of things you can do with Metricstor and kind of give you a sense of what it makes easier. So first of all, what is observability? So there's a quote from Peter Drucker, who was a business management consultant, and he said, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And that's kind of been changed around in a lot of different ways. But in general, the idea behind that quote is that if you don't know what your system is actually doing, if you don't have some sort of concrete metrics about how it's performing or what it is that you want it to be doing, there's no way that you can make it any better or know how bad it is. So observability is kind of this larger concept now. It includes monitoring and alerting. It's sort of been evolving a lot recently, but it's basically just instrumenting the systems, services, and applications that you're running. And sometimes it includes visualization. It can be graphs. It can be charts, gauges, whatever it is that you need to be able to actually see how your system is performing. But collecting those metrics, visualizing them, alerting on them, but giving you insight into your system so that you can really understand how it's doing, how well is it doing, how is it performing compared to how you want it to be performing. And one tool that's kind of come up more recently is the concept of SLOs and SLIs. So those are service level objectives and service level indicators. So it's giving you a way of saying, here are the goals that I want to hit. Those are the objectives. And here are the actual metrics that I'm reporting that tell me how close I am to those goals, or am I exceeding those goals. And we'll talk about those a little bit and kind of what they are. So from the Google SRE book, so the Site Reliability Engineering book that Google put out a few years ago, it's actually a great book. It's open source. If you want to go read it, it's all online. But they talk about a lot of these different concepts in pretty good detail. But they kind of came up with this one set of things to monitor called the 4 golden signals. So kind of the key things that you want to look at in any system. And there are some older kind of groupings of metrics. One is called RED, looking at rate, like rate of throughput errors and duration, and the other one is USE, which is utilization, saturation, errors. But these are kind of like groupings of things that you want to keep in mind together to sort of give you an aggregate view into your system. But Google's kind of taken it and made it a little bit more generic and included these 4 things. So latency would ideally be if you have something like an endpoint or a service, how long is it taking to respond to requests or return data to a user? Traffic, how much like actual user level throughput is it servicing? Errors, so like the rate of errors, how frequently are they occurring? How many per unit time? And then saturation, how close are your services getting to be fully utilized, or do they need to be scaled up? And then so taking those 4 golden signals, I think there was one last thing on this other slide. Yeah, so there's a whole chapter on this in the SRE book. So if you want to look at these in more detail, they go into them a bunch more. So check that out. So kind of looking at SLIs, what is a good SLI? If you're looking at these 4 golden signals and you want to actually use them to sort of talk about your system. So a good SLI as an indicator should be something that's relatively opaque to the system. So it should be like a user. Your user doesn't know what any of your microservices are doing under the hood. They just use it and know how it should be returning data to them. So you want your metrics to sort of resemble an end user experience. So don't try and use any like funky internal state of your system. You want to actually be measuring something the way that a user would see it. And you want those metrics to be specific as well. It should be something that's a relatively concrete value. So don't measure it in a unit or a term that a user wouldn't be familiar with. And then kind of making sure that these SLIs actually represent a real user value. So if it's not something that your user is going to care about, if it's not something that's going to actually impact how they use your system or the value they get out of your system, you might be coming up with an indicator that's more focused on developers or an operator. And sometimes those internal metrics can be useful, but in general, if it's not something that actually impacts a user, it's not something that you should maybe be considering to make into an SLI that you actually want to make part of your larger observability platform. And then finally, SLIs should be architecture agnostic. So this kind of goes back to the previous points as well. It shouldn't really matter how your systems are implemented or what tools or what stack you're using. It should be facing into the system, looking at it as a user. So try to figure out measuring things that would still be valid even if you changed out the implementation underneath. And then on the other side of it, what makes a good SLO? So what is something that you actually want to make that objective that you kind of agree on with users? So in a way, the SLI is a thing that you can measure. And the SLO, the objective, is more like a contract. So if you have operators on one side and users on the other, what is the actual objective target that you want to hit? So if it's like an error rate, is it 0.5% or something, or is it like a number of errors per hour or something like that? So what is the actual contract that you want to make that your goal as an operator is to hit or exceed? So for SLOs, they should represent some sort of business value. So if we're talking about error rates, if your error rates start to climb, that's probably going to impact business value. So it should be something that keeping those under a certain threshold should be valuable to the company, to the users in some tangible way. It should be relatively defensible. If somebody comes to you and says, I want this endpoint to return in under 10 milliseconds, well, there should be a reason for it. There should be some need for it to be where it's set at. There's no reason in looking for 5 nines or 6 nines or something like that of reliability if the cost of doing so exceeds the value of actually implementing it. And then finally, the other side of it is, once again, the SLO should, again, represent user value. It should be something that makes the user experience of your platform, your app, whatever. It should be something that's actually valuable to them. So kind of the way that this frames it here, if you meet an SLO, your users should be happy. So that should be kind of the underlying goal. You find the SLIs that you can measure, and you set SLOs in order to meet that sort of happiness threshold for users. Okay, so that's observability in general, but let's talk a little bit about Metricstor. So what is it? So I don't know if anyone in the room has actually used Metricstor yet. It's relatively new. We open sourced it earlier this year and been contributing to it ever since. But it's basically, it started out as a project called Logcache, which is now a part of CFD. But as we started using Logcache more and getting more services using it, getting user feedback from it, we realized that the in-memory cache duration of Logcache, so all it does is store envelopes from the fire hose in memory. As people started using it, they said, this is great, but the memory limitation is kind of a problem because I would like to have more than a day or two of data. Like ideally, I'd like to have several weeks of data. And it'd also be nice if it didn't go away every time I restarted my Logcache instances. So as we started talking about it, we realized that we kind of needed to approach the implementation differently. So what we did is took Logcache, and instead of it all being in memory, we actually use an on-disk time series database storage engine. So actually write all of the envelopes to disk now and kind of built a new project around that storage interface, and that is what turned into Metricstor. So at this point, the code bases are pretty different, but it originally started as just a fork of Logcache. But the goal was, rather than it just being like any arbitrary time series database, we built it to work specifically with Cloud Foundry in terms of ingress, authentication. It's basically just a drop-in time series database for Cloud Foundry, and I'll talk about how that differs from other things as well in just a minute. By default, it gives you 6 weeks of storage retention, and we shard the data in days. So essentially, as data expires, we can just delete the oldest day. So you get 42 days of storage by default. That's user configurable. If you don't have a lot of volume on your foundation, you can scale that up. But ideally, 6 weeks is pretty comfortable for most people, but you could potentially go to years if you have the disk storage for it. So it connects directly to the RLP, the reverse log proxy of the Loggregator fire hose, and we have a component called the nozzle that just ingests everything that comes in. Everything that's a gauge, timer, or counter metric just gets pulled in. We don't do anything special with logs because there's way too much variability there. So it basically pulls everything in without any filtering and processes it and stores it internally. And then on the query side, we had started doing this a little bit with Logcache. Originally, Logcache had its own proprietary endpoint for queries, but we actually took the entire Prometheus query engine, just dropped it right in, and kind of connected that to our storage engine. So Metricstor actually now has like a full PromQL query engine that you can use as well. The one that we had added to Logcache was only supported a subset of the queries. So essentially now we've just taken the query side Prometheus, some stuff from Logcache that made it easy to run on Cloud Foundry, and a new storage engine, and put them all together. So basically, you can get the best pieces of PromQL with a persistent store that works natively with Cloud Foundry. Okay, so quickly, why not use some of the other things that are out there? This is definitely not the first time series database, and there are lots of other things in the ecosystem that people ask about. So why not use Prometheus? So Prometheus is great for a lot of use cases, but by default, it wants to scrape endpoints. It wants to have a lot of metrics endpoints that it goes out and collects data from. Those have to be configured and those have to be available. And right now, that's not the way that the ecosystem inside of Cloud Foundry works. It's something that we're moving towards in newer versions of Loggregator, but right now, it's just not available. So you'd have to do a lot of work to implement that and make it work and make it go out and scrape. And there are still some things coming through the fire hose that have a resolution that's lower than 10 seconds. So right now, Prometheus, by default, would just scrape everything every 10 seconds. So that's how quickly you get your data. Stuff coming through the fire hose still has a very event-based design right now. So 6 to 12 months from now, maybe Prometheus would be just as good of a drop-in choice. But for now, Metricstor gives you the ability to work with the way that things are currently designed and give you the storage that you would get with something like Prometheus. InfluxDB. So I mentioned we're using the InfluxDB storage engine, but once again, InfluxDB has its own ingestion format, its own query language, and it's not necessarily something that's very easy to get up and running on Cloud Foundry by itself. It's totally possible, and there are Bosch deployments for it. You could get some decent experience. But in general, what we were going for with Metricstor was making it as easy as possible to just add a component that works out of the box and doesn't require anything special to get all the metrics in. And then Datadog, and there are other SaaS services as well, are actually a great way to get insight into some systems. But the problem is that you still have to add some sort of library or component that's going to push stuff to Datadog. And I don't know, I'm sure other people in the room have used Datadog at some scale. It gets really expensive. And it's easy to kind of get hooked and just be like, oh, we'll use Datadog for now. It's fine. And then you realize your bill is just growing and growing and growing. They're doing well as a result as a company, but it's kind of you get on this road where you become entirely dependent on another service, and it kind of puts you further away from being able to get observability in your own system. So, and then any other time series database. The story is basically going to be the same. There are lots of things out there. The story is always changing, but in general, like I said with Metricstor, we want to make it as easy as possible to just drop it in and get some easy success. So on the visualization side, I'm just going to plug Ravana pretty aggressively. It's probably what almost everyone out there is already using, but if you haven't used it before, you're not sure what it is. It's basically an open source tool for building visualization dashboards. You can configure a ton of stuff now. It's also got some built-in alerting as of recent versions. You can do data exploration, kind of look at the data that's actually in there before you build graphs. And it's been around, I don't know, for probably 5 or 6 years, and before that it started out as a tool called Kibana that was part of Elasticsearch. So it's kind of been modified over time and is now essentially as good as you could possibly get in a data visualization tool, and it's all open source. They have some closed source offerings for like organization management and things like that, but what you get for free with the open source tool is pretty fantastic. It also lets you connect to other data sources, so if you have other things like Elasticsearch or InfluxDB or Prometheus, you can kind of get all of your data sources in one place, which lets you build dashboards from multiple sources. And then one other nice thing is there's an OpenID plugin that'll use OAuth with UAA, so you can actually get some authentication built in with Cloud Foundry and Metricstor, and you don't have to do anything crazy. There's still some limitations to how you can manage data sources as part of the open source version, but in general, it works pretty well out of the box, and you can just hook it up and get up and running. And we've got a blog post that we put out a little while ago about this. I think if you look for, Pivotal Metricstor, Grafana, it'll probably come up, but kind of walks you through the steps of getting that set up. And just as an example, this is kind of a generic observability type dashboard. So it's got some gauges up at the top, so you can kind of see over a period of time how many logins or signups this system had, memory utilization, how the logins have changed over time. So you see kind of in that second row of graphs, there are some dips there. So that might be something that there's an SLO on where if logins drop for a certain period of time, that throws an alert, and that somebody might go take a look at that. But otherwise, if it stays within a certain threshold, everything's fine. And this is kind of what you might expect to see as you start building out an observability dashboard, kind of adding your own metrics that you really care about as you start to define your SLIs and SLOs. So I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about PromQL, which is because, as I said, we kind of took the whole Prometheus query engine. So PromQL is the language that we've adopted just because it's so ubiquitous within the Prometheus ecosystem, which is now becoming more a part of Kubernetes deployments and things as well. So people are generally pretty familiar with it. So if you wanted to, you could write your own queries against Metricstor just using PromQL like you would with Prometheus, or you could use a tool like Grafana and kind of build your queries there. But this is the form that they're going to take. So it's essentially you're going to have a metric name. So in this case, the first one, it's CPU. So that's just like a metric that is emitted that tells you what the CPU utilization is for a particular instance. And then you can give it a set of filters. So in this case, we're filtering on the source ID of Doppler. So if you run this query, this first style of query is called an instant query. So it will give you the most recent value by default, and it just gives you 1. It doesn't give you a range of times, it just gives you now. And you can move that to a previous point in time if you want to see what it was then, but in general, these instant queries are kind of what you'd expect to see if you're getting like a gauge. Like if you go back to this previous screen on Grafana, like those top ones, all you're looking at is like what are the current number of logins and now. So 174, 273. So those type of queries will just give you an immediate result. Range queries, on the other hand, are kind of the other style of PromQL queries, where if you give it a time range, it will allow you to get a series of points, and that's something that you would graph or do some other aggregation on. But in general, range queries, you provide a time range, and then this thing that's bolded here in brackets, so that would tell it to give you 5-minute buckets. So basically, it would give you points spaced 5 minutes apart over a given time range that you could graph or do other processing on. But in general, those are kind of the two forms as you start working with queries inside of PromQL. And then, as I mentioned on this last bullet point, there are lots of other functions built into PromQL that you can use to try and do more analysis, whether it's averaging or things like that. And I'll look at a couple examples now. So we've been doing a lot of playing around with Metricstor internally. And as we started talking to some customers and trying to see how they wanted to use it and what kind of data they wanted to get out of it, one thing that we got asked several times is, well, how can I see what applications are using the most resources? I don't have any idea how to figure that out. And some people have, like interns going through and like scraping data and putting together spreadsheets and try to figure out like, pull all this data together to figure it out. But really all this information comes through the fire hose. Like we have a ton of information from Diego that we can put together in a query and figure out, who's actually using how many AIs are my apps using. So in this case, this is using a function called TopK, which will give you the top, K results. So in this case, we're looking for the top 5. And then it will take sort descending. So it's going to look at the count of the number of CPU metrics coming out, and then it's going to sort them in descending order. So it's going to have highest to lowest. And then this bottom line here is telling it to group them by organization, space, and app name. So that'll actually give you, per org space and app, it will actually break it down so that they're all bundled in that way. So for each app, it's going to do the grouping first, and then it'll do the top on it. So it's going to take all the CPU metrics, count them, sort them by app, and then it'll give you the top 5. So when you run this query, it's going to be a huge JSON thing out. If you look at it in Grafana, it'll be much nicer to look at. But this will actually give you that list of AIs, and you can look at that. You could graph it over time. You could look for an app that's spiked suddenly or one that's dropped. And this could be something where you could set an SLI or SLO on it. It could be something that you just have an alert condition on if you suddenly see that an application is using way more resources than it should be. But this is just one example of the kind of data that you could pull out of Metricstor that you actually get without having to do any work, because we're just taking all the data from the fire hose and pulling it in and giving you the ability to run queries on it. Okay, and then a second example is if you want to look across all of your Diego cells and see how much unused memory you have. So this would be allocated and running instances that are just not being used. So this one's a little bit hairier just because we're doing some math. So we're actually looking at the memory quota metric, and then because of the way that we're getting some of this data out, instead of it being sourced, it's coming out as exported job. But this is saying look at the memory quota for all the Diego cells, and then subtract the memory. So in this case, the memory metric is just memory utilized. Same thing with CPU. It's assuming that it's the utilization. So we're taking the quota and subtracting the utilization, and that gives you the amount in bytes. So then we're just doing some quick math here to give us gigabytes so that it's easier to look at. But ideally, you can run this across your entire foundation and see how over-allocated you are. So how many more resources have you allocated than you're actually using? So for some customers and some users of Cloud Foundry, you want to be able to do this periodically, or just have this be something that is a target to make sure that you're always using maybe 70% or 80% of your memory, so you can tell if you need to scale up before there's a problem, but also not be wasting money in the meantime. And once again, this is stuff that just kind of exists automatically. It's in the fire hose. Metricstor is going to store it and give you the ability to actually run queries against it. So a lot of the work here is just figuring out what's the information that you want to actually be alerting on. And then kind of going into a little bit more detail about PromQL. So once again, as I said, we're using the Prometheus query engine directly. We're actually now also using the API handler. So everything basically that Prometheus exposes, we're exposing as well. But these are the primary endpoints for actually running your queries and kind of like looking at the data that is available. So those first two endpoints are the ones I discussed already, the two different kinds of queries, instant queries and range queries. There's an API endpoint that lets you actually find out what series exists. So if you're doing some exploration in Grafana, it's probably using this under the hood, but you can pass some labels and find out what series match those labels. You can get a list of all the label names. So if you're looking at the sort of the tags, so if you go back to these PromQL queries, so we've got like job equals Diego cell, that's a label. Exported job equals Diego cell. Those are labels, so you can kind of do some exploration and say like, oh well, what are the things that my data is tagged with, so that I can actually learn about those and filter them down. And once again, if you're in Grafana and you do kind of an autocomplete as you're starting to fill in these labels, these are the endpoints that it would be using under the hood to kind of like get that data. And then the last one is label values, which if you give it a label name such as exported job, it would give you a list of all the possible values. And I put asterisks next to these last two because we made one slight change in Metricstor. There's some of the stuff that comes through the fire hose that's really noisy in terms of labels. So things like request URI, user agent, things like that. There are probably 5 or 6 things that come through, and the values that come through are just they're not anything you would ever filter on because they're so noisy. And sometimes the URIs can be 20,000 characters, something like that, if it's just got a bunch of query parameters. So we decided to make those non-indexed for memory usage purposes, and just because it would potentially cause problems with visualization tools if you tried to list some of these things in an autocomplete. So those are the only things you won't see in the label names and label values endpoints, and I think it was a good usability choice that has ended up working out well, but they're still stored there. So if you did do a query for one of those things like request URI, you can still get the data back. You just won't be able to see it in part of the label names and values endpoints for autocomplete. And then there's a ton of really good Prometheus documentation. If you want to go look at it more, it kind of talks about how these API endpoints work, what the data formats are. But if you just do PromQL API, there's a pretty good set of documentation out there. And then kind of to recap, so the big thing that Metricstor gives you is the ability to take all this data that already exists in the fire hose and pull it in and make it available to you through the PromQL API. So now if you use Metricstor, you have an easy way to have access to that data, run arbitrary queries on it, work with your teams internally and externally to define SLIs and SLOs and figure out, okay, now that I've got all this data, what do I want to do with it? What are the things that my users care about? And what is like a set of initial SLIs and SLOs that we can start to put in place and figure out how we're using the system, how it's performing, and that gives you the ability to improve. And then being able to settle on a tool like Grafana, whatever it is that you end up using, but have something that makes it easy for you to see how you're doing with those goals that you start to define and how the data is doing. It kind of gives you and the rest of your team the ability to look at this stuff over time and say, like, oh, we deployed something and all this changed. Like, let's go back and look into it now. And Metricstor, since it stores everything for a long period of time, lets you have that for free, basically. And then as you start to set these SLIs and SLOs up, you can decide, oh, we thought this thing was really important, but it turns out nobody cares about it. So you can start to retire some of those SLOs, those objectives, if you realize that maybe nobody cares when this thing actually drops below 80%. And you can kind of come up with a tighter set of things. And that's one of the things when you start to use other tools and you're not defining your actual objectives, you can just end up with dashboard after dashboard of metrics that people don't care about. So a good process here is to kind of review them periodically and just say, oh, hey, these actually aren't serving us very well. Let's either come up with some new ones or just get rid of them and try to keep our observability scope as tight as possible. And I think that's it. Questions?
Yeah. So because you said that it supports PromQL API,
yeah.
Can we use directly as a backend on Grafana?
Yeah, you can. So you actually will just set it up as a Prometheus backend. And as I was saying, there's an OAuth plugin for Grafana. Oh, right. Sorry. The mic. So and I turned it down already. So I think the question was, since it supports the PromQL API, can we just use it directly as a backend in Grafana? And the answer is yes. You just set it up as a Prometheus backend, and you can use the OpenID plugin that I was talking about in Grafana. So when you configure Grafana, you can just set that up as a kind of a UAA plugin and point it at your UAA, and that'll give you some authentication for free. But yeah, it just treat it like a PromQL backend.
So how do you configure the alert configuration? Whenever there's a certain metric reaches its threshold, how do you send the alert using Metricstor?
So you're asking, like, how do you actually configure the alerts?
Yeah.
So in this case, Grafana has some basic alerting capabilities. So in that case, there are kind of two ways you can run Grafana. One's just kind of like as a client-side application. You can also run it as like a server-side, so it's running all the time. And you can configure alerts within Grafana and you can configure those metrics that you're looking for and how it's going to get triggered. Then at that point, you need to figure out, is it going to send an alert to Slack or is it going to send something to PagerDuty? So that's kind of dependent on how the rest of your team wants to configure their whole alerting and paging stack, which is it's a much bigger conversation and how you want to actually get reported on those things. But I would say try using Grafana alerting initially, and then there are other tools that you could configure. So I know like some of our teams at Pivotal do use Datadog for that. So we'll actually push alerts to Datadog for the things that we really want to see, and then set alerts there. And that goes to PagerDuty, and then that alerts the rest of the team.
Okay. So we use Ravana, which collects metrics from the fire hose. So
okay.
There is a closure script, right? I think you might be aware of it. So you write a closure script. Even before it goes to the influx TV, it sends the alert whenever it reaches the threshold. So does Metricstor has some any mechanism on that? Because I don't have to create any alert in the Grafana dashboard. I just write down a closure script for some metric using the syntax.
Yep.
So whenever it reaches some threshold, because it's directly getting from the fire hose, and it always checks before it insert into the influx TV.
Yep.
So the moment it reaches its threshold, it immediately sends alert. So you can
Yep.
send it to mail or Slack, anything. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can basically just use the PromQL API directly, and you can query those metrics. And you probably want to use that instant query endpoint, the first one, because that'll just give you the current value. So anytime that script runs to get that value, then you can just have it compare to a threshold. And one other thing that I didn't mention in this talk and should have is that we've been doing some work. There's another Prometheus component called Alert Manager, which you can configure. So we've actually been working on adding support for that. And I think it may have actually landed. I'll have to check, but keep an eye on that as well, because that's something we're working on. So you'll be able to configure Metricstor to run some of those alert queries internally, and that can push to an alert manager process, which you can have configured as well. So we don't have a lot of documentation on it yet, but that's something that we're working towards. Since we have so much compatibility with Prometheus, we're able to do some of that stuff. So configuration might be a little bit weird right now because Prometheus just takes like a static YAML to configure that stuff. But I would say within the next few weeks, that should be in master, and we'll probably cut a release of Metricstor as well that has that and talk a little bit more about that. But definitely, if you have questions about that as well, feel free to talk to me after.
Just thanks. It's very good things. I would waiting for that since long. The metrics was a long awaiting feature. You can get it from Firehose, but you get into some many security issues, right?
Right. Yep.
If you want to get whole CF exporter Firehose.
Exactly. Yep.
But now I have a question to this metric tanks. Is it still one deployment, or you can deploy it per org? So you can somehow say, okay, get me only metrics which are for this org.
So right now it'll connect and just get everything, and then as you query it, so it uses UAA to do authentication, and it does CAPI for some authorization. So it'll use Cloud Controller to figure out what you're allowed to see. So right now it just pulls one set of metrics for the entire foundation, and then per user, as you authenticate with it, it will let you see what you're allowed to see.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and we're still working on some more of that stuff, but admins can see everything. If you have some certain scopes, you can see everything, and then other users will be filtered based on what they're allowed to see. So we may do some work to try and make it easier to limit that, but for now, that's worked pretty well for us to just let people kind of use UAA and Cloud Controller to kind of limit access. And then I'm doing another talk right after this one that kind of talks a little bit more about the internals, and I kind of go over some of the components, and there's a thing that sits in front of Metricstor called the auth proxy, and that actually limits who can see what.
Okay, thanks. And I assume no sensitive information, just metrics.
Just metrics. Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
thanks.
Yeah, no problem. All right. Thank you, everybody.